Hi, I'm Mike Stark.
And I'm Michael Leshner.
Better known as the Michaels.
I'm a retired assistant Crown attorney and gay rights activist. We met in '81, so marriage wasn't even considered back then. It wasn't in our radar. In our radar, I always referred to it as, from a legal context, dinosaurs roamed the land. And I mean it literally, that you did not exist as a gay couple. You just didn't. You were invisible, no matter that you were publicly known as a couple. You'd go to people's homes as a couple. When it came to the law, you did not exist. Back in '88, for a variety of reasons, I sued my attorney general because I wanted same-sex benefits and pensions for Mike. We had been together 7 years by then. And in part, that's why it became such a personal fight. I would work with colleagues, and they'd be in relationships, common law or marriage, and as long as they were straight, they had all the benefits and their survivor pension for their spouse. I could have written the Magna Carta Part 2, and it wouldn't have helped Mike whatsoever.
Well, I think part of it is it wasn't talked about. Gay people really weren't really forming that many long-term relationships back then either, because it was so difficult. It was really, even before a lot of people were coming out, it was really, I would say, kind of the infancy of the gay rights movement. Like in '81, there really wasn't a lot happening. And I believe the bathhouse raids really did change everything. Not just so much per se gay marriage, but I think it really taught the gay and lesbian community that they really were powerless and that they couldn't depend on City Hall, the provincial government, their national government to protect them. And that what they realized that they had, if they wanted these protections, if they wanted a voice, they had to fight for it. And I really do believe that that's when things started to change from a gay and lesbian perspective.
So 4 years later, we won same-sex benefits and a pension for Mike that also included that provision for all gays and lesbians in the Ontario government who were in a common law or married relationship. Well, they couldn't be married. And so that was the start where we existed for the first time as a legally recognized constitutional couple. And that was 1992.
And I think that was also a very important decision, because I think it really woke up a lot of gays and lesbians, and they realized that, yeah, why shouldn't my spouse have these benefits? And the great thing that also happened is the snowballing effect. Then a lot of major corporations started giving their same-sex employees that benefits, and then other provinces. So when you look back in the history of the gay rights movement, you can see how each decision kind of builds on the last one, and I think you need to have a few key ones to get the ball rolling. But once that ball starts rolling, it's really quite incredible to see how things can really change and affect not only gays and lesbians, but how it affects society at large.
And what became critically important over time was the mindset of gays and lesbians changed as well. That until there was effective social change, gays and lesbians, many of them found tolerance acceptable, because tolerance was better than discrimination. And they hadn't fundamentally tasted equality. And so it was a fundamental learning experience for everyone. One can argue you don't get an equality until you demand equality. And you don't demand equality until you've been educated yourself. It's a very sad commentary, but when you don't have something, i.e. when you're poor and you growing up poor, the fact that you don't have certain things that money can buy, you don't think about it most of the time because it's not within your reach. There had been a major amendment to the Human Rights Code of Ontario that allowed for no discrimination towards gays and lesbians, but that was us as individuals. It wasn't us as couples. And
but it's like what I said, you need all these little pieces of the puzzle before you can get the puzzle finished. And I also believe that in any civil rights movement, you are going to have leaders, and most people are sheep. And Michael used to always get so frustrated that there were so many sheep. But I would say, but look, you could look at the women's rights movement, the black movement, like all these movements throughout history. There's always a few pivotal people, and they're willing to put their lives on the line, or put themselves out and really do the heavy lifting. And once the sheep see that, the gate's been open and there's not a wolf there to eat me, then they will slowly go through that gate. But it's important in any movement that you need people who are willing to make those first steps.
Well, curiously enough, the more out I became, the more calm I was. That I had more of a problem being in the closet than being out of the closet. And I was lucky that I was in government, in public service, because if I had been in private practice, I would have been let go and maybe given a severance package. But the difference was, because I had a public profile, I think government didn't know really what to do with me. Yes, they could have got rid of me, and they could have given me a severance package, but I think they were concerned with what would the political damage be, and would I really go away, or would I sue them and allege, what would I allege? Let's put it this way, when someone says you can't marry or you can't do this, it's not teenage angst anymore. It's that I'll make up my own mind what I want. And, curiously enough, if we had lived in the land of equality and you could marry or not marry, and our laws weren't, if they weren't fundamentally structured around marriage, you may opt for no marriage. But it's much easier in many ways in terms of the laws, and if you die, how your estate moves on to your spouse without negative repercussions.
And I think also, by having same-sex marriage, it gives same-sex couples, I think they look like they're more accepted in society. You're not the outcast that, you've got to kind of be hiding around, or, if the route had been civil unions, then it's still not equality. We'll let you marry, but we're not going to call it marriage, we're going to call it civil unions, because you're not really quite ready to have that yet. We don't feel comfortable with that. So I think by allowing same-sex marriage, it's an acknowledgement that your relationships are just as valid and require the same rights and responsibilities as anyone else's. So it really, we can talk about all these different things, but it really just comes down to basic equality. And I think we've always said to people, it's not that we're saying that every gay and lesbian couple has to get married. All we've ever said is that it's important that as gays and lesbians, we have the same starting line as everyone else. We'll make as many good decisions and bad decisions as anyone else, but we don't want to be held back because the laws of the land say you can't participate in these various you know, basic functions in life.
It was a very hopeful decision that we had another building block towards marriage, but that case was fundamentally about support payments for one female spouse towards another spouse. We knew that unless and until there was an actual marriage case, we wouldn't get to marriage, because fundamentally the marriage for same-sex couples was a political issue. It was a simple legal issue, as M&H had pointed out, but the political willingness, the desire, the impetus towards marriage would have to come from the courts. There wasn't enough social change in the air for the government to be proactive. They weren't going to lead on this issue. They were going to very much follow. And, you know, a lot of these politicians, their religious issues, their personal religious views were standing in the way of our equality.
And I think also it boils down to that they might not have been the ones who champion it, because then it could be thrown back at them. Most people resist change. I mean, we know that throughout history. Change is never given up easily. Change is usually fought for. And so we were not naive enough to think that any step along the way that all of a sudden, you know, the domino effect, and they're just going to lie over and say, yeah, we'll give you everything you want. We know that it doesn't work that way. And if it meant that, okay, you wanted one more case, we'll take one more case. If it meant two more cases, you do two more cases. Because we could see that time was on our side and that the public was on our side, and that it was really just a matter of convincing the government through the courts that what we were striving for was the right thing to do. And
fundamentally, the Conservatives were a hopeless cause, that it was really, could we persuade the Liberals? And if you could persuade the Liberals together with the NDP, then you could, if they were still the government, we could achieve marriage equality.
When the two ceremonies went on at the MCC, you know, it was an audacious move on their part. And I think what it did, the good thing what it did is it focused the attention in the public's mind, because that obviously was a big news story. But the thing that it wasn't able to achieve was it was still a religious ceremony, and it was done through a very archaic way of getting around it, which was fine. I mean, you know, good for them to have come up with that. But that we knew that that wasn't going to be the end of the story. It was kind of like an interesting way of getting to the end point. And I think it was kind of interesting because a lot of the opposition to same-sex marriage has been religious. So to think that you could actually use religious means to have in the church a same-sex marriage, I think was, you know, pretty good on their part. But we knew that it wasn't going, you know, that wasn't going to be the end of the story. It was just kind of an interesting twist.
But for most people, they weren't going to have a religious marriage ceremony involving banns. That what made the most practical sense was if gays and lesbians in relationships wanted to go down to City Hall or have a judge marry them, or anyone who was allowed to officiate at marriage, made a lot more sense than at the time entering marriage through a religious ceremony.
Yeah, and you have to also remember that a lot of gays and lesbians have had very traumatic experiences because of religion. So most, you know, there's a lot of gays and lesbians who want nothing to do with any recognized religion because it doesn't recognize them. So, you know, as Michael was saying, in the big picture, it's not a practical solution. It was an interesting event that happened, but it really wasn't going to be the solution to the problem.
And it was fundamentally important that that our freedom would come from the court, that would change the law. And because the law trumps Parliament, and you know, we could beat them back with the law. The law used to be, was always used against us, but as over time, the important thing that the march to equality was through changes in the law, and the law, when Parliament was unwilling to do it, was through the Charter of Rights and the courts. The case split 2-1. One of the 3 justices said we could marry right away. 2 of the others said, no, we're going to give Parliament 2 years to change the law.
What did you think of that?
Well, you know, how can I put it? We were thrilled in the sense that we knew within 2 years it was there. You crossed the River Jordan.
And the good thing was you had all 3 saying
yes.
You had 1, which is very important. It wasn't even 2-1, it was all 3. So that's a pretty resounding victory. So we took the opportunity, and Michael proposed to me.
Publicly. We didn't do anything in those days that wasn't public. But you know, what I thought was very important at that moment, and I guess it crystallized in the public's mind, is here was a court decision. Here were 2 men who had been together since '81 who couldn't marry, where one of them turns to the other and says, will you marry me? And Mike said, of course I'll marry you. And I think it was what you call one of those public educational moments when people see, if they're being honest, that it's really a love story. It's fundamentally 2 people who, over time, have tested their love. They want to be together. They want to marry. And what's the problem?
Yeah, I think it was just a very, as odd as it sounds, a very natural moment. It wasn't anything that we said, okay, if we win, let's do this. It just happened. And I think that honesty was captured.
And for most people, if they're being honest, most married people, they realize the relationship isn't straight up. It's up and down and sometimes crises. And they would say, I think their thinking was, God, they've been together 20-odd years. What more do you want from people?
Yes, I mean, it was almost surreal. I mean, the whole day was surreal. You know, we were at the legislature when we got the news, and then there was a press conference, and people were discussing it. And I think that, you know, you're caught up in this whirlwind of activity that, you know, none of us are really ever prepared for. I mean, what did we know when we met in '81 that we'd be involved with this amazing process? So you're really just, there's no roadmap, you're just basically reacting. And so I think that, you know, it speaks volumes as to who we are as a couple.
And that day, we also went down to City Hall to get a marriage license, followed by the press. And I just thought, it's a wonderful moment. I can marry. Before you marry, you have to get engaged. We've never been engaged. I had no ring. But I also think, as a litigator in court, I knew it would be a wow moment. I liked wow moments. And
really?
Yeah. And that was a wow moment.
And it was great because then we had an opportunity to throw an engagement party. So we, I guess a month or 2 later, we actually had a engagement party. We were able to invite our friends and relatives, and that was an amazing experience.
Like a real couple.
Right, but just to experience that, things that I think, for me, when I came out in 1980, my view was my life is going to be just terrible. And so for me, to see this happening was just wasn't anything I ever allowed myself to think that was possible. So, you know, that's the power of when you take action, of how you're able to change your life and change those around you. And so, you know, those are very, like for us, probably that engagement party was more, well, I mean, I'm being a little biased, probably more special than most straight couples because they've never thought they couldn't. But as a gay male coming out in 1980, I never thought that would happen. So to me, this was like almost a fairy tale, pardon the pun. And it was wonderful. Yeah, I came out when I was 22. Well, I grew up in a very Catholic family in rural Nova Scotia. Well, I was the military background, but my formative years would have been, you know, in small town Nova Scotia. You know, homosexuality wasn't talked about. There were no positive role models. Don't forget, this was when I grew up in the 70s. I moved to Toronto in '76. There really wasn't anything to encourage or to nurture that experience. So I think that, and Michael being 10 years older had it worse than I did growing up.
Yeah, I didn't come out till I was 24, 25.
So I think for us, that is another reason what propelled us to continue this journey, this mission, because of what we went through. We didn't want anyone else to have to go through that. I'm not saying that we've eliminated all coming out stories and that, no, we haven't. But we also have allowed for young people coming out, it's a less scary place than when we came out.
And I spent many years in therapy, probably about, I'd say, up to 8 years in therapy, trying to undo a lot of the psychological damage that being in the closet. And fundamentally, for your viewers, you have to remember that being in the closet, just basically think of it as living with fear. Every day, day in and day out, you didn't know which way to turn. What would your life be? Where would you end up? If I tried to act out positively, would I be smacked down? Would you lose your job? Would you... That was the tenor of the times, and that's why people may not understand why gays and lesbians didn't demand equality right away, but tolerance was a big step up from discrimination.
Before we get to the day of June 10th, 2003, I want Michael to just give us a little story of some of his strategizing leading up to it. Like, as they gave us, I think, 4 or 5 days advance notice that the decision was coming down. So then Michael kicked into gear.
Yes, we were given a date, and I think the June 10th may have been on a Monday or a Tuesday, very early in the week. And Michael and I went out, bought new suits, got rings. We were going to, if the decision was favorable, marry. That day, I had lined up 3 Superior Court justices who would marry us if the decision was favorable, because speaking with our lawyers, we thought it was critically important that the public see us married, legally married, even if we were just one couple, because I don't know if it was hubris or just good legal acumen. I didn't think the Supreme Court would undo the Michaels wedding. And I didn't think the public would want the Supreme Court to undo the Michaels wedding. And if they couldn't undo or wouldn't undo our wedding, then it seemed like just one more impetus towards marriage equality for all.
But we could tell by the way the case, like in the courtroom, how the case was going, how the judges, like the judges, what the questions they were asking, we felt we would have been crushed if it hadn't happened the way it did, because certainly the vibes from what we were getting, and you have to remember, we've been with this story for quite a while, so you get to kind of know how things are going. So we felt pretty comfortable, but again, you can't, you know, you don't want to get over.
The real issue was going to be, in our minds, would there be a further delay? Would the Court of Appeals say they've got a year or 2 years, or would they give us right off the bat the right to marry? And of course, if you're looking back on it, the Chief Justice was sitting on the panel, which was very important. And curiously enough, he was the Attorney General when the bathhouse raid happened. That if the court had the courage of their convictions, they could just sweep it all away and give us the right to marry. Then I thought, well, the government, the federal government, is going to appeal. And it became very important to have one of us, one couple at least, married. And I could affect that kind of change if it happened.
June 10th comes along,
Yeah.
and here we are.
That's the decision
Yeah,
that comes down.
Yeah, decision day, June 10th. So Michael and I grab our suits and our little suit bags, hop on the Bay Street bus, and take the bus down to City Hall. I get off at City Hall and go over to Osgoode Hall, and that's where we pick up the decision.
Right, and then I start singing.
First you opened it.
Well, opened it, realized what had happened.
You go right to the end.
And I start singing the song from My Fair Lady. We're getting married in the morning, and it was morning. And we all march out, and I'm singing this, and the press knows what's happening, and they're everywhere. Just, you know, you're on cloud 9, then you're on cloud 90, and then you're on cloud 390, and everyone wants a piece of you. You know, you're not yesterday's chopped liver. You're whatever everyone wants. And
yeah, it was an amazing, euphoric day. I don't think
it wasn't a local story. It wasn't a provincial story. It wasn't it wasn't a national story. It was a world story.
And the funny thing, not the funny thing, the thing that we had thought was, if it did happen, that, you know, we'd get married at the courthouse, and that we would have one print journalist, one TV, and one radio.
To have us have a little privacy.
So that it was a little bit of normalcy. Well, that was like,
Yes.
that was, you can't imagine, the press was like, how, we've covered you all this, how could you not do this, how could you do this test, it's so important. And we didn't fully appreciate the enormity, and not just the enormity, but that it was so important to get it out there. And so here we have this, I mean, a few other things happened before we got married, but here we've got this, we ended up getting married in a coat check room.
Right.
Because they wouldn't allow us to get married in a courthouse.
At that time, allegedly, you couldn't get married in a courtroom, even a courtroom not being used for a trial. I don't know if at the time it was just that it was too new and they didn't.
I think they panicked. They probably didn't expect like this. It really was pandemonium. So here we are in a cloakroom.
Yeah,
and it
where
was,
you hang your coats. And yes.
And here we are, so there's Michael and I, and then the two lawyers were our witnesses, Michael's mother, and a few of the cleaners, and then the rest of it was the press. And it was like, here we are getting married in front of...
A few lawyers.
Yeah, but we're getting married really in front of...
Cleaning ladies.
Getting married in front of the press. I mean, you've got like, you can't even imagine like all the cameras set up. And
I love the fact that the cleaning ladies, who I had known for years, were there and they were clapping. And it's so primal an issue. You realize marriage is something that everyone understands from whatever culture, from whatever part of the world. And they would look at us and they just saw two happy people.
And I think they saw that, you know, they could probably understand that it was historical. It was, we were making history. And even though it wasn't the wedding I ever envisioned, you know, there's a part of me would say I wouldn't want it any other way because it was so unique, so different. But it was still, it was, I was going to say it was on our terms, but it really wasn't.
My mother had dementia, and I was concerned how she would react. I mean, she had no experience of two men getting married. Thankfully, she started to sing "O Canada." And people probably thought that this was a wonderful Canadian moment. And it was a wonderful Canadian moment. But it was my mother somehow.
Well, I think they must have said, I think someone must have said something about Canada, and then
Yes.
that just set her off, and she'd start singing a couple times. And again, it was one of those moments that it wasn't
fortuitous
scripted.
luck.
It just. But the other thing that was so bizarre is that because we didn't know what the decision was, and when we could get married, we didn't tell any of our friends or family. Michael's mother happened to be in a nursing home not far away, so we, you know, got a cab to pick her up. But like,
And an articling student.
but the rest of our family, you know, found out on the news. You know, I mean, that's
Yes.
how bizarre it was, because again, this was not your traditional wedding. We didn't have time to plan it and send out invitations. It was like we were reacting to
Family from California, from North Carolina.
from Nova Scotia.
Yeah.
And so it was really this bizarre, even people I worked with, I mean, no one knew until that decision was released. So it, again, like, you know, this is like where you kind of humanize it. I mean, it's a very bizarre, in a lot of ways, experience, but really still quite magical. You know, it was the end of a journey of this. It was wonderful to celebrate this victory, because it was a victory on different levels. So there was like the legal victory, there was the actual getting married victory, and it was an affirmation of us to each other, and that, you know, again.
It was a love story. I mean, that's fundamentally what it always was about, that why it was so personal for both of us was it was fundamentally society or politicians or the church being mean to us, you know, saying you couldn't do something. For example, that day when I was interviewed by the CBC and they had told me the mean thing that Ralph Klein, the then Premier of Alberta, said, and I wasn't going to let anyone rain on my parade, and I said, well, if he said that, then he must be suffering from mad cow. And I think that's what, once you taste freedom and equality, that it's amazing just how powerful you think you are. And it didn't matter to me that I was name-calling Ralph Klein and that he was a premier. It was that he was a bully.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think basically it was, we were able to celebrate something that had been denied to us for such a long time, and I think that, I don't know if the enormity of it actually hit us then, but I think it was just that celebration of, we've done it. And this is amazing, and let's just savor this moment. And then, you know, then after the wedding, then it's like you've got like the whole round of interviews and that, which is wonderful, it's important to do, but you need that time. And the other little side story was the judge who married us, Judge Hamilton, he actually called us up to his chambers, and he married us actually there first. He said, you know, let's do it up here, just so that, you know, it's quieter. And so we did like this little, just the three of us, a little ceremony.
Some respect for the ceremony. And then we married again. So actually, most people don't know that we in fact married twice that day.
Within hours.
Right.
Well, within minutes, but.
People in Ontario could marry right away.
Right, and then, you know, it wasn't long then a few other provinces changed their rules around same-sex marriage. There's a few holdouts until it became official through the Supreme Court, but, you know, if that was, it seemed unnecessary to us, but we knew this was like the mopping up, really, and we really never felt that it was going to be overturned or.
But it was another example, and particularly any group who think they've been discriminated against. Here it was mostly male politicians struggling with, can they say yes to marriage? In the same way, if you're a woman and you were married to a man over the decades, what you had to put up with can you go get an education? Can you go get a job on your own? Can you do this? Can you do that? Nothing was fundamentally different against gays and lesbians than it was with other groups who were trying to achieve equality. The wonderful story is that with gay marriage legal equality, it becomes very, very difficult to discriminate against gays and lesbians, at least here in Canada. That, you know, there are issues like transgendered rights. There are issues like gay and lesbian clubs in high schools that the Catholic Church is still trying to regulate. And they're having an increasingly difficult time. We already had adoption. We had equality in the military. We had work benefits and pensions. These were all building blocks that when we met in '81, none of that existed, none. It didn't start to really change until the early to mid-90s.
Well, when they decided to take it to the to send their legislation to the Supreme Court to see if it was in sync with the Charter, to me it was just a bit of a stalling tactic. I didn't get overly frustrated because I knew what the decision was going to be, but it was just, again, another unnecessary step from our perspective. It really didn't matter. I don't think like that 2-year difference didn't make a hell of beans of difference, or whatever that expression. It just didn't seem like it was necessary. It was almost like they were covering up their tracks in case someone pinned this on them. They could say, well, the Supreme Court said it was okay. Like, it really just seemed like it was an unnecessary step, but if that was what they had to do.
I was more angry than Michael because it was all about, particularly in my mind, politicians, male politicians, religious groups, still trying to hold people back for no good social objective other than their own self-interest. It was, I thought we were trying to achieve a public good, an enormous public good, equality. And here were these people, as usual in history, saying, no, not yet.
Mm-hmm. And that's what I mean, like, change takes time. It's unfortunate, but we at least had the satisfaction of knowing we had won. And if it meant there was a little bit of mop-up, fine. It shouldn't have had to happen, but we still knew that we had won the battle.
You won the war.
The war, sorry, yeah, the war.
Actually, you won the war.
Yes. I think we as Canadians, we've always said this was a Canadian story as well, that, you know, I think we can be proud that Canada, I think, was the 4th country to legalize same-sex marriage, and that's something to be proud of. If you look at what happened south of the border, it took them a lot longer. They finally got it right, and who knows how long that will last.
Germany, just this week. has gay marriage, within a couple of months, the law will be proclaimed. And
yeah, I think the other thing, what I find not amusing, but what I've noticed is, and I knew I would notice it, when we were going through the various court cases and all the arguments that were being flung against us, that it would be the breakup of society, the breakup of the family, all the doomsayers, the doom and gloom. It's so wonderful to see that 14 years later, society still exists in Canada. We're still voted near the top of we're still, if not number one, at the top few, the best countries to live in. There are still children being born, there's still families, life goes on. So it was never about us taking anything away from anyone else. It was never about us getting anything special. It was always just about basic equality, basic equality. And it's wonderful now to be able to say, okay, we did that. And look, see, life goes on. We haven't taken anything away from you. If anything, I think we've made the country even better.
How could we not but be proud, immensely proud, because from where we started to where we ended up, and that old song, I Did It My Way, which fundamentally is so very true, that I think that what the public latched on to with the Michaels was that they seemed like a genuine, honest couple. That what you saw is what you got, that they talked the same way as if they were in our living room, or we were out on a picnic or on a boat ride, and that particularly, I think myself, when I was being interviewed, I had always tried to be truthful and honest, and I think over time, the public, the press, everyone realized I was telling the truth, that everyone who was against me was just being small p political or lying or scaremongering. And the public has had enough experience with people who throw that kind of prejudice around to know it and smell it when it's happening.
Yeah, I think we were able to put a public and a very understandable face to the issue. And
it's a good thing we both had the same name.
that's true.
The public loved that. They loved our dog, who was better looking than we were. He also had the name, he had Schmikey, not Mikey, not a different name. And
I think we just, as Michael said, what you saw is what you got. I mean, we didn't put on any pretensions. We could maybe have the odd little bickering in public. I mean, it was just that we were doing this for all the right reasons, and we weren't afraid to, I think we led through example, like rather than, pontificate and then do something else. I think we truly believed this, and we lived what we preached, and I think it just resonated with so many people, and I think it, it did make a difference. And
the public would say, oh, you're so courageous, you're so this or that. And I think the public realized the only self-interest we had was that we loved each other, wanted to marry and live our lives as best we could.
But also to not, as I said earlier, we also wanted to make this world a better place for people coming up. We didn't want...
That's true, very fundamentally so, because we both had difficult experiences growing up, and...
we just wanted to, it was another way we used to say it's like our way of giving back. We've been given so much.
I didn't want the young to spend 8 years in therapy again, like I did. For what?
Right. So I think that also must have come across. And even to this day, 14 years later, we still have people who will stop and say, are you the Michaels? And I'll say, thank you. There was an elderly woman yesterday. We were out having coffee, and she as we were leaving, he said, "Are you the Michaels?" And we said, "Thank you for what you did." And, you know, she was in her 80s. And so that shows you that even after all this time, it still resonates, and that we forget, I think, sometimes how it's affect people. Like, we've had one day we were walking down Bay here, and a young man was on a bicycle. He went by us, he stopped, he came back and said, "I want to thank you. I was able to marry my boyfriend last year." So it's those, when you hear that, you just realize that, sure, it affected us, and we know it affected the larger society, but when you actually get those face-to-face encounters, it reinforces that what we did was the right thing to do, and that it's made a difference.